Bonjour tout le monde, mon nom est Raed El-Ferjani, je suis agent d'échange de connaissances et de mobilisation autochtone au Centre de foresterie des Laurentides et j'animerai ce webinaire. Avant de laisser la parole à ma collègue Evelyne Dufault qui va présenter la conférencière, voici quelques consignes d'usage. Au bas de votre écran, veuillez fermer votre caméra si ce n'est déjà fait. Pour activer la boîte de chat, cliquez sur l'icône bulle en bas à droite. La période de questions se fera à la fin de la présentation. Finalement, j'aimerais mentionner que le webinaire est enregistré. Je laisse maintenant la parole à Evelyne.
Merci Raed. Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis Evelyne Dufour, directrice de la division durabilité forestière au Centre de foresterie des Laurentides. Bienvenue à ce webinaire de la 38e saison des colloques du SCF-CFL. La conférence d'aujourd'hui, qui se déroulera en anglais, s'intitule National Peatland Mapping and Carbon Accounting. C'est avec plaisir que je vous présente la conférencière Cara Webster. Madame Webster est titulaire d'un doctorat en sciences de l'Université de Guelph, d'une maîtrise de l'Université de Calgary et d'un PhD, un doctorat de la Western University. Cara travaille comme chercheuse scientifique en écologie des sols forestiers au Centre de foresterie des Grands Lacs depuis 2010. Elle étudie le cycle du carbone et des éléments nutritifs dans les sols forestiers et tourbeux afin d'améliorer les politiques de durabilité des forêts dans un climat en changement. Elle utilise une suite d'outils analytiques, notamment la surveillance et l'expérimentation sur le terrain, la cartographie à l'aide de systèmes d'information géographique et de télédétection, ainsi que des modèles de simulation empirique et basés sur des processus. Je vous souhaite un bon colloque. Je laisse maintenant la parole à Cara.
Merci Evelyne pour cette introduction et merci à tous d'assister à ma présentation aujourd'hui. Je ferai cette présentation en anglais car bien que j'ai vécu au Québec pendant 10 mois l'année dernière, mes enfants disent que mon accent est cringe. Toutefois, j'ai traduit la plupart des textes figurant sur les diapositives. So I'd like to first acknowledge that the work that I'm presenting today is truly a team effort. Since I started this project in 2014, many different people have been involved in this project. Each person has brought a different expertise to the team. Some of these people are now retired. Werner just recently retired, Cindy and Jag several years back. Kelly Bona actually started with us as a postdoc on this project, and now I feel like has become herself a research scientist working with Environment and Climate Change Canada. And over those years, we've had many different people helping us along the way. So I'm going to start my talk just by talking a little bit about wetlands and defining what a wetland is. A wetland is land that has water at or near the surface for prolonged periods of time during the years. And because they are wet, the decomposition is very much slowed, and that results in peat accumulation. And so peat is that sort of partially decomposed dead organic matter, the dead vegetation, the dead mosses. And so peatlands are a very specific type of wetlands in that they are wetlands that have accumulated more than 40 centimeters of peat. So as you can imagine, with that thick organic layer, it stores lots of carbon. But because you have that anoxic or low oxygen environment, some of that decomposition results in not only release of carbon dioxide, but also methane, which, as we know, is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And so the Canadian wetland classification has 5 classes of wetlands, and that's shown on this diagram here. They're shallow water, marsh, fens, bogs, and swamps. And so shallow open water, marshes, and swamps are typically are classified as mineral wetlands. However, swamps can also be peat forming as well. So the peat forming ones are sometimes swamps, but also the fens and bogs are considered peatlands. So many people, when they think of wetlands or peatlands, they think of very open systems, but they can also have varying degrees of tree cover. The other key point is that we often think of wetlands as being quite large, but actually wetlands can vary quite a bit in size. Some can be quite large, so you can think of like the Hudson's Bay lowlands or the Mackenzie Valley area, but others can be actually quite small and can be hidden within the upland forest mosaic. So I'm going to show you a couple pictures here, just to give you sort of a feel for what these different types of system might look like. On the top left there, swamps are characterized by having tree cover. On the right-hand side there, you see a rich fen, and they tend to be dominated by grasses and sedges. On the bottom left there, you can see a poor fen, and they tend to have more shrub cover and some larch trees. And on the bottom right are bogs. And bogs typically have these thick mats of sphagnum mosses and black spruce trees. Of course, there's a lot of variation within each of these different peatland classes, but that gives you a little bit of a feel for what each of these different types might look like. So peatlands have many different ecosystem services. This graphic on the left highlights 13 different ecosystem services of peatlands, but essentially we can sort of summarize the key ecosystem services of peatlands according to sort of the carbon storage, the regulation and storage of water, and of course the biodiversity within these unique ecosystems. And in recent years, there's been increased international pressure for reporting on peatland carbon emissions and removals, not only because of the important carbon ecosystem services that that peatlands play, but also because of the increase in disturbances to these ecosystems. And I want to point out that Canada has a very important role in this international discussion because of the large amount of peat area that we have. So how much peat do we have? Well, in fact, we have 25% of the global peatland area. So that's astounding. And this represents 12% of our land area. And that carbon represents almost 60% of all of our soil organic carbon. And most of that resides in the boreal and subarctic areas. And of course, we know that these areas are not only going high rates of climate change, but also are being impacted more and more by disturbances. So I think there's a clear need to be able to quantify carbon and emission and removals from peatlands at a national scale. So what we need to do is we need to build on our scientific understanding so that we can help inform our reporting policies and strategies. So this includes better understanding of climate change impacts and impacts of disturbances in peatlands, informing conservation efforts and mitigation strategies, but also contributing to programs such as nature-based climate solutions and obviously fulfilling our national inventory reporting requirements. So our goal was to quantify peatland carbon and emissions and removals across Canada. So to do this, we developed the Canadian model for peatland, or we call it CAMP for short. And CAMP runs as a module within the GCBM, the Generic Carbon Budget Model Framework. And so GCBM is focused on the upland forests, as most of you are probably well aware. And so CAMP is focused on the peatland areas. And there is an intermediate one, it's called Moss-C, and this was developed by Kelly Bona during her PhD, which considers that intermediate step of upland soils with a thick moss layer. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on the model. I encourage you, if you're interested, to look at our 2020 ecological modeling paper if you want more details. But essentially, CAMP uses the GCBM for the tree biomass part of the model, but then it has its own peatland specific pools for moss, sedge, and shrubs. And then, of course, the soil is a bit different in the peatland module. It's represented by two peat pools that are split into an upper oxic layer and a lower anoxic layer. And that boundary is determined by the long-term water table, which is a function of drought code. And so a key feature of the peatland module is that the emissions from the peat pool is based on the mean annual temperature, but also fluctuations in the annual water table from the annual drought code. And of course, we include modeling methane as a part of those emissions. So fire disturbance is also is included. We have disturbance matrices for fire, as is forest harvesting, although the forest harvesting is done in a fairly simplified way. And like I said, if you want more details on the sort of the model infrastructure, I encourage you to look at that paper. So that's the basic model structure, but there are several key data requirements to run the model. So the first is having some sort of classification scheme for the different peatland types. So in the current version of the model, we consider 9 different categories that are a combination of the wetland type and the canopy cover. So we can consider bog, poor fen, rich fen that are open, treed, and forested. And those cover categories are consistent with the IPCC category guidelines. The second data need is for spatial input layers. So we need a map of peatlands that represent those categories. We need the annual drought code that drives the water table. We need climate parameters, and then we need the national fire and harvest maps. And the third data need, oh, sorry, I accidentally skipped ahead here. The third data need is the field data to be able to calibrate and test the model. And over the years, we've developed several different databases to help support in those needs. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about the peatland categories and mapping them. So as I mentioned, these represent a combination of wetland type and forest cover. So in theory, these 11 categories should be represented. So we have the bog, the poor fen, the rich fen, and swamp. As I mentioned, these are all peat forming systems. And so that represents a nutrient gradient from nutrient rich to nutrient poor and forest cover. And so that combination is really critical to capture the carbon dynamics within these peatlands. However, as I mentioned in the previous slide, we're only considering 9 of those categories. We don't include the swamp category. So we found that it's relatively easy to, bogs and fen categories are relatively easy to map because they tend to have consistent species composition in those categories across the country. But what constitutes a swamp is quite different depending where you are across Canada, and they're often difficult to consistently map. Also, compared to fens and bogs, swamps have generally been poorly studied, and there's a lot less field data for this peatland category to calibrate and validate the model. So surprisingly, when we started this project, there was no national peatland map as a raster layer. Existing maps were either only polygons or did not include tree cover or did not include the categories that we needed. So we went about creating our own peatland map by building on Dan Thompson's treed and forested peatland map, and we added in an open peatland category from a different product. So then we used the proportion of larch from the NFI KNN product to differentiate between bog, poor fen, and rich fen. And so this peatland layer is not perfect. In fact, it's far from it. We know that there are lots of issues with this layer. However, it was really the only product that could give us the categories we needed for the modeling. And peatland mapping is very much an area of research that is highly active right now. In fact, I wanted to give a call out to two of your colleagues at CFL there, Luke and Andre, that have just recently in the last month published, along with Dan Thompson and colleagues from Carleton, a new peatland map product that I think is going to be that's a real improvement from what we have previously done, and we're looking forward to sort of incorporating this new product into our future model runs. So we have now applied the CAMP model across 64 million hectares of peatlands over a 30-year period from 1990 to 2019. And the paper describing these results just recently came out in January. So what I thought I'd do was just cover a couple of the key findings from that paper. And so this map here, these maps here show the distribution, or will show the study area and sort of the distribution of the peatlands within that area. So the map on the left shows the wetland class, and the map on the right shows the amount of forest cover. So as you can see from these maps, that forested bog and poor fen cover the most of the area in this study area. But before I get into the results, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a reminder or a primer on carbon jargon. So remember that gross primary productivity is the total amount of carbon that is fixed by plants through photosynthesis. But some of that is lost as plant respiration. So that remainder is considered or called net primary productivity. But some of that net primary productivity dies and is then subjected to decomposition by soil organism. So that is referred to as net ecosystem production. But then some of that material may burn, and then that is referred to as net biome production. And then furthermore, some of that dead organic matter may actually become dissolved and leave the ecosystem as dissolved carbon, and that remaining is thus referred to as net ecosystem carbon balance. But for the purposes of today, I'm going to be concentrating mostly on net ecosystem production and net biome production. And then on the right-hand side, you can see what the different types of emissions are, or removals from each of those processes. So here I'm mapping the average net biome production over 30 years. So on this map, the purple areas are net sources to the atmosphere, and the green areas are net sinks to the atmosphere. So over that 1990 to 2019 period, you can see that most of the peatland area is a sink or sequestering carbon. You can see a few purple areas or sources, and you can probably guess that that's due to fires in these peatlands. And if you track that below there to the graph below, you'll see that I've graphed both net ecosystem production and the net biome production over that 30-year period. So that net ecosystem production is that total length of the bar, and then the net biome production is the green portion of the bar. So essentially the purple is the total amount of carbon lost to fire. So what I want to highlight here is that the boreal plains have a very high net ecosystem production, but also lose a lot of that carbon to fire. Whereas if you look at the Hudson's Plain, in contrast, it has less net ecosystem production, but also less is lost to fire. So let's take a look from the perspective now of what is going to the atmosphere in terms of emissions. So it's also interesting to note the regional trends in the different emissions. So in this set of panel of figures here, I have emissions from CO2, from methane, wildfire specific emissions, and then the bottom panel is the total of all of those. And so what's interesting to notice, you can see, as mentioned previously, those carbon dioxide emissions are highest in the boreal plain, but you tend to have higher methane emissions in the boreal shield and the Hudson's plains. And then the fire emissions are highest in that boreal plain and also that boreal shield west area. And then, of course, the bottom is the sum of all of those emissions. But now let's shift a bit and look at temporal trends. So again, the top graph shows the net biome production again. And here you can see that most years those peatlands are a sink. Some years are stronger sinks than others. However, there are years that those peatlands are a source. And so in the bottom graph, you can see the contribution from different emission sources for each of those years. So it's clear that those source years are clearly linked to those high fire years. But I do want to point out, looking at that blue asterisk there, that there are years where there is less fire and peatlands are about neutral. And this really highlights that the controls on decay are also very important. So let's look a little bit further at some of the temporal trends across two different contrasting regions. So here I contrast the boreal plains on the left with the boreal shield on the right. And so on the top, again, is that net biome production, and on the bottom are the emissions. And so on average, both of these two ecozones seem to have about the same net biome production, but the boreal plain is much more variable than the boreal shield east. You can see on the bottom there that the gray line, the CO2 emissions are higher in the boreal plain. But if you look at the methane emissions in the yellow, the methane emissions are higher in the boreal shield east. And of course, those fire emissions are higher in the west. And so these two regions differ in several ways, which drive these different carbon dynamics. So the boreal plain tends to have different peatland types. So they tend to have more forested peatlands and be dominated by fens. They also tend to be a bit drier and have higher rates of fire. Whereas in contrast, the boreal shield east tends to have more open and bog dominated peatlands, tend to be a bit wetter and slightly lower fire rates. So it's really these differences that drive the differences in the emissions from these different systems. So in this paper, we also looked at forest harvesting. The graph on the left shows that there are years where fire disturbs more area than harvest. But then there are some years when harvest disturbs more peatland area than fire. And so in the western ecozones, fire is the dominant disturbance in peatlands, whereas in the east, the boreal shield east and the Atlantic Maritime, harvest is the dominant disturbance. So we do make some simplifying assumptions when we model forest harvesting in peatlands that we realize probably will require some refinement in the future. So we assume that the trees are clear cut, and we assume that there's no direct emission to the atmosphere in the year that it's cut. Instead, some of the harvested biomass is obviously removed, and any residue that's remaining is transferred to the dead pools that decay slowly over time. So we are planning some improvements to the disturbance matrices. And the other thing that we need to incorporate is the impact that the harvest has on the water table, because we know that that's an important impact of the harvesting. So the results from this do show in the bottom right figure there that including the harvesting does result in a small reduction in the net ecosystem production, which is most noticeable in that boreal shield ecozone where the peatland harvesting is more prevalent. I did want to point out that we currently, because I'm sure someone's going to ask this because of the importance of peat harvesting in Quebec, we don't currently model harvesting of the actual peat itself as a disturbance type, but this is something that we're working on. So just to highlight some of the insights that we've gained with this work. So we've developed the camp model, and we've been able to quantify greenhouse gas emissions and removals from Canada's peatlands. And we've been able and recently applied it to quantify emissions and removals from those 9 peatland types across 5 ecozones for that 30-year period from 1990 to 2019. And so what we've seen is that, as we hoped, these peatlands are a carbon sink in most years, except years where there's large areas that are burned. So hopefully I've convinced you that peatlands are an important part of our forest carbon landscape, and that we can explain that heterogeneity, spatial heterogeneity in the carbon sequestration by the different types of peatlands in these different areas, and the environmental conditions and the prevalence of fire. And of course, that temporal variability is very much driven by that year-to-year changes in the environmental and fire conditions. And so I think one of the key findings that we found from this work is that, in particular, the forested peatlands are large, but also a very vulnerable sink of carbon. So I just wanted to let you know about where we're going next. We're continuing to make improvements and refinements to the model. One of the key things that we're always looking for is, obviously, any modeler will tell you they always need more data. We need more data for the calibration, particularly small trees, shrub biomass, moss and sedge productivity and turnover, that type of information. It's not always easy to get. And obviously, data for validation is very key too. So annual greenhouse gas emissions and removals. And of course, trying to apply this at a national scale, we need those across peatland types and in different ecozones as well. We also need improved spatial layers. And so I talked a little bit about some of the improvements that are being made in terms of the peatland maps. But there are other things such as mapping the peat carbon pools and biomass that would be extremely helpful as well. And another key thing is data related to the water table. This is not data that's necessarily easy to obtain, and it's critical to help us calibrate our water table modeling. And we've used the drought code approach, but it needs to be sort of calibrated within different ecozones. And the other key link is the link between that water table and how to better reflect the methane emission processes within the model. So those are things that we're currently working on. One of the things that we didn't get to in this current paper was to do a sort of a full uncertainty analysis, and that's something that we have planned to do this year. Other things that we're hoping to do is to include some climate sensitivity to the productivity, as well as looking at different climate change scenarios and changes in fire regime. We're really interested to run the model for this most recent fire year, where we know that there was lots of area burned. Although I'm almost scared to see what the results are from the last year, fire year. And then we're continuously trying to add additional disturbances. I talked about the peat harvesting, but Kelly Bona is very much working with other folks to include other effects such as mining, oil sands, mining in particular, the effects of removing of peat or piling peat, and the impact of linear features, those types of disturbances in peatlands as well. And then the other new aspect is we're looking to expand the module development of camp, and there's sort of 2 additional modules that we are working on. The first is one related to soil temperature and permafrost carbon dynamics, and we're going to be calling that Camper. And the second part of that is looking at lateral flows of carbon to aquatic systems, and that will be part of Camp Doc. And this was money that we received from Parks Canada to develop these modules and apply them in the Hudson's Plains. So we're very excited to get started on that work. And finalement, l'émission découverte de Radio-Canada a diffusé une émission intitulée Le secret des tourbières. Et je vous encourage à la regarder. Il y a même une interview avec Dan Thompson qui parle des feux de tourbières. Thank you. Merci, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Merci beaucoup, Cara. Thank you so much. Pour ceux et celles qui se sont joints à nous tardivement, mon nom est Raed El-Ferjani et j'animerai la période des questions. Avant de débuter, j'ai des messages d'intérêt et quelques règles d'usage à partager avec vous. Vous pouvez tous maintenant activer votre vidéo si vous le désirez. Si vous désirez obtenir une attestation de formation continue, notamment en lien avec le règlement sur la formation continue obligatoire des ingénieurs forestiers du Québec, l'unique façon est de compléter l'attestation de participation avec le lien URL que vous trouverez dans le chat sous peu. Veuillez noter que le code d'activité est maintenant intégré dans le lien. Vous pouvez poser votre question dans la langue officielle de votre choix. Il y a deux façons de le faire, verbalement en cliquant à droite de votre nom dans la liste des participants et sélectionner l'icône main levée. Lorsque je vous nommerai, vous n'aurez qu'à enlever votre mode sourdine en cliquant sur l'icône micro. Après avoir posé votre question, s'il vous plaît, vous remettre en mode sourdine. Nous souhaitons avoir une question à la fois, autant pour donner la chance au conférencier, à la conférencière de bien répondre à votre question et de laisser la chance à tous de poser leurs questions. Si vous préférez poser votre question par écrit, vous pouvez utiliser la boîte du chat, sélectionner l'icône en forme de bulle en bas à droite pour l'activer, si ce n'est déjà fait. Nous vous demandons de vous identifier clairement en donnant votre nom et l'organisation que vous représentez. So we will start soon the question period. There are two ways to ask your questions. Verbally by clicking to the right of your name in the list of participants and selecting the raised hand icon. When I name you, please remove your mute mode by clicking on the microphone icon. After asking your question, click back on mute mode. If you prefer a written question, you can use the chat box. Select the bubble icon at the bottom right to activate it if it's not already done. We ask you to clearly identify yourself by giving your name and the organization you represent. La période de questions est maintenant commencée. David Paré a une question.
OK. Je viens juste de trouver comment mettre le son. Merci, Cara, pour une belle présentation. En fait, j'ai deux questions. Je vais commencer par la première. You know, when a forest burns, there's a lag before it becomes a sink again. I was wondering if this is different because you presented the summation of the whole landscape. So is it quicker? Do you have a feeling for that when a wetland burns or the different types of wetland? Does it recover more quickly than a upland forest?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I completely know the answer. My thought would be because a lot of the recovery in the peatlands is in the moss layer and then the shrub layer, that a lot of that is probably recovered quite a bit quicker because there's not necessarily as much tree cover. But I can't sort of put like a time period on that. But I mean, there's very much, I mean, it's complicated in the peatlands because of the change in the water table. And so you get the water table rises after the fire because a lot of that peat has been burned, and so the water table and a lot of that photosynthesizing material has been removed. So you get a raise of the water table rising, and so that is promotes a lot of sort of the regeneration of that sphagnum, but you also get whatever decomposition is occurring with wetter conditions. So you're going to be getting more methane. So in terms of sequestration, it's going to be returning to a sink probably more quickly. But in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, you're going to be getting more methane emissions.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kara. Est-ce qu'on a une autre question orale?
Moi, j'en ai une autre si jamais il n'y a personne.
Je pense que pour l'instant, je vois personne, David, alors vas-y.
Yes, my second question was, when we map things, we suppose that they are stable. I was wondering, with the different categories and especially the open and closed forests, if you expect this mapping to be stable in time, can there be some shift? And so, if so, do you need to revise the mapping on after a few years? What do you say about this?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So when a disturbance happens, so say forest, so a fire or harvesting, we assume that it's returning to the same peatland type, but we know that that's not always true. Also, when you consider, say, permafrost thawing, that that is not going to stay as a pulsar or a peat plateau. They're going to transition to some sort of thaw feature that's more like a fen type system. So right now, and I think modeling over shorter time periods, that we can sort of accurately say that that's a relatively safe assumption. But if we start modeling over longer time periods, then we're going to need to consider that we need to be updating that map, probably not on an annual scale, but at a decadal to 20-year scale, that we might need to be refining what those peatland types are. I mean, the other part of this is that some of these areas will actually no longer become peatland anymore. Like if the fire interval is return period is rapid enough, that these may actually transition to mineral or upland, types of soils. And so when we're modeling over long time period, those assumptions don't hold, and we'll have to have updates to those distribution of those different peatland categories on the landscape.
Thank you. Une autre question orale ou écrite? Je rappelle que pour vos questions orales, vous aurez à lever la main, appuyer sur l'icône main levée en bas à droite et activer ou désactiver le mode sourdine. Si vous préférez une question écrite, vous pouvez l'inscrire dans le chat box à droite.
So I will make the comment that if any of those you folks that are out there this year and you're doing work in areas that might have peatlands or wetlands, and you have the opportunity to maybe stop into one of those peatlands or wetlands and even take a few measurements, like water table measurements for us, please contact me if that's something that you could help out with. A lot of these measurements are not difficult to do, and having spatial coverage of some of these measurements would be so useful for our modeling efforts. So just a shout out to anybody that does work and runs into sort of peatlands areas as they do their work. If you can help us out, let us know.
Nous avons une question de Joanie Boll Merci Cara pour ta présentation très intéressante. Are forested peatlands still largely underestimated considering the difficulty to differentiate these ecosystems from upland forests from satellite imagery?
Yes, I think there's still issues, but this paper that Luke and Andre were part of is trying to get at some of those issues. And so their paper in their approach, they were looking at sort of using a combination of different sensors to try and get at over some of those difficulties. Because using only, say, optical sensors definitely has the trouble that you're only seeing sort of the overstory, and that you might be missing those types of categories. So you really do need to be using that kind of approach where you're trying to use combination of information to try and separate out, you know, what is forest versus what is a forest with a thick peat, you know, a thick organic layer versus a forested peatland where there's actually some saturation in there. So it definitely is very tricky. And I think that also goes for the swamp systems as well, where you have often quite, you know, heavily covered systems, and you need to use sort of other clues as to what's happening in the understory. And using, you know, digital elevation models, you know, terrain characteristics to sort of combine those sources of information to get at what type of peatland is there. So yes, I agree that those are still quite challenging to differentiate.
Okay. Merci Cara. Thank you. Jérôme, une question?
Bonjour, Cara. Thank you. Great presentation. Maybe I missed it, but I was wondering if your model was taking into account nitrogen levels, and if so, what would be the impact of atmospheric nitrogen deposition on productivity and decomposition?
Yeah, so at this time we don't include nitrogen. The only time when nitrogen comes up is in the combustion from fire. So that is included in as a greenhouse gas, obviously not a carbon greenhouse gas, but it is included. So right now we do not include nitrogen. So nitrogen deposition is not considered. The one thing that kind of unrelated to it, but might be interesting to some people, is that we know peatlands are a source of methane, but we also know that upland soils can draw down methane, and that is also something that we're currently not accounting for, is what role upland soils might have in terms of drawing down methane. But no, as of right now, we don't include nitrogen.
And do you think it's an important things to add? Is it really meaningful, the nitrogen deposition and its impact on peatland carbon balance?
I think I think it's important, but I think at the scale that we're modeling, it's not really realistic to include it. And so a lot of the, in perhaps in some ways, we already sort of encapsulate perhaps the nitrogen dynamics in terms of looking at sort of the decomposition rates. So inherently, we kind of take into account, say, like carbon to nitrogen ratios, which may affect decomposition. And we know that, for example, for mosses and that type of peat, that those carbon to nitrogen ratios really do affect the decomposition rates. So in some ways, we sort of capture it by the calibration data that we have. I think at this point, it's probably, you know, it would be too difficult to also incorporate sort of nitrogen budget into some of this.
Okay,
maybe in another 10 years.
Thanks.
Merci Jérôme, merci Cara. Est-ce qu'on a d'autres questions orales, écrites? Il n'y a pas d'autres questions, Jérôme. Alors, si tu en as d'autres, vas-y.
Yes, maybe Kara, you talked about if we want to help you by measuring water table in peatlands. How do you do that? Is it difficult? What kind of equipment do we need to do that?
Yeah, it's actually quite simple. So essentially, you need to be able to sort of put down some sort of narrow diameter tube into the peatlands, and then essentially just taking some sort of, like, it could even put just a measuring tape along like some tubing, and you just sort of lower it into the cylindrical tube, and essentially you just blow into the tubing, and as you go down, all of a sudden you'll hear bubbles as it hits the water table. And so just measuring what depth below the surface, you start hearing the bubbling. So it's something as simple as that. I mean, there's a lot more complicated ways. If this is a permanent site that you have, that you could potentially be monitoring water table for us sort of on the longer term, then there are more sophisticated ways to doing it. But just using kind of that bubbler approach is very accurate.
Très bien. D'autres questions orales, écrites? Je vois pas d'autres questions. Alors, j'ai une petite question, Kara. It's concerning the evolution of the type of peatland and the type of cover. Do you have historical data about the kinetics, about the change that have probably occurred during the 20, 30, 40 past years? Types going from swamps to bogs, for example, to fens, or vice versa? Do you have that data, or that trends at least?
So there are some areas where there's been sort of paleoecology work done, where they will take peat cores and they will analyze at different depth increments along the way, and they can look for different species remnants or pollen or seeds, and they can actually do sort of reconstruction of what the peatland type was over time. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of areas with that type of information, but based on a lot of those studies, we understand that there is sort of a succession in terms of peatland. As peat accumulates over time, it becomes more disconnected from the underlying water table or groundwater sources underneath, and becomes more of like a bog system. And we know that under other circumstances that they may become wetter, for example, permafrost thaw, and then there is these evolution of peatland types. And so we very much rely on sort of those paleoecological studies and peat reconstruction approaches to get that kind of information. There has been a lot of work done for example, in the Hudson's Bay lowlands, where you actually are getting isostatic rebound in terms of since the glaciers, and we're actually gaining land in sort of northern Ontario because of the rebound of the land since the last glaciation. And they're able to also sort of look at that space for time in terms of how far from the coast, and looking at sort of the evolution of peatlands that way as well. But those occur obviously at extremely long time scales, from hundreds to thousands of years.
Okay. And in terms of short term, do you think that climate change, warming, increase of fire frequency, and so on may have an impact on the type of peatlands and their covers? in the coming years?
Yes, I think for sure that that's going to be, you know, drying, you know, some areas are getting drier, some are actually getting wetter. You know, we're getting, you know, if you have frequent fires, that's going to be, you know, converting it back to an earlier sort of seral stage or converting it even completely to more of a mineral or upland system. So I think that those kind of changes are perhaps becoming, you know, accelerated because of the rate of change in terms of those climate conditions. It's in some ways, it's actually easier to look at sort of long-term carbon accumulation rates using these paleoecology approaches. It's more challenging to look at more recent rates of accumulation because you need to do more careful studies in terms of how much biomass is, you know, a sphagnum moss putting on every year. And so those are actually very, you know, site intensive types of studies where they actually, you know, tie on wires or strings to look at, you know, annual increments in sort of the biomass. It's not as straightforward as sort of measuring tree rings like we do in forests. So it's those more recent accumulation rates are a little bit more difficult to get a handle on in terms of peatlands. But definitely, I think with, you know, dramatic changes and higher rates of change in these environmental conditions, we're going to see, you know, more dramatic shifts in these types of peatland ecosystems.
Thank you. Alors, je ne sais pas si on a des questions orales ou écrites. Alors, pour rappel, si vous avez des questions orales, veuillez appuyer sur l'icône main levée en bas à droite de votre écran. Et si vous avez des questions écrites, vous pouvez les inscrire dans le chat box. On va attendre un peu. Il me semble qu'on n'a plus de questions, donc s'il n'y a pas de questions, on va s'arrêter là. Merci beaucoup, Cara, encore pour cette excellente présentation. National Peatland Mapping and Carbon Accounting. En terminant, je vous invite au prochain colloque qui aura lieu dans 2 semaines, le jeudi 18 avril 2024, et qui s'intitule « La translocation des sources de semences de l'épinette blanche à de nouveaux environnements et son effet sur la qualité du bois ». La présentation sera donnée par Isabelle Duchesne et Patrick Lenz, chercheur scientifique au Centre canadien sur la fibre de bois de Ressources naturelles Canada. Je vous invite également à surveiller notre fil Twitter et LinkedIn pour en savoir plus. Merci encore pour votre participation et bon après-midi. Au revoir.